It's late, I know, but I'm glad you're here. Tonight, we're going to unearth a quiet truth that rarely makes it into textbooks, that being a god-king Pharaoh of ancient Egypt wasn't always the golden dream it seemed. Beneath the towering pyramids and divine decrees were stress headaches, incestuous family trees, and a very real chance of being murdered by breakfast. So if you've ever thought your job was hard, at least you weren't expected to make the Nile flood on schedule. If you enjoy drifting through history's stranger corridors, you're welcome to subscribe, but only if it feels right. Leave a comment if you're listening in the dark, or if it's 3:17 a.m. and you're still not asleep. You're not alone. Dim the lights, and let's drift back in time. Somewhere around 1,300 years before Common Era, a teenage boy puts on a crown made of gold, lapis lazuli, and the combined weight of an entire civilization's belief system. The crown fits perfectly. It always does, because it was never made for the head. It was made for the image. From the moment a pharaoh was crowned, he was no longer a person, not entirely. He was the literal human embodiment of Horus, the falcon god of kingship, war, and the sky. Which sounds impressive until you realize that falcons don't get to cry in private or tell their mothers they're overwhelmed. And that's the thing. Nobody tells you how lonely it is to be a living god. Behind the ceremonial kilt and eyeliner, behind the sculpted jawlines and statues 20 cubits tall, there was almost always a boy, a son, a nephew, an adopted heir, someone who had maybe played Sinette in the garden 6 months ago, and now found himself expected to balance the cosmic order of the universe, while also avoiding being poisoned by his advisors. This wasn't just about ruling people. This was about maintaining the sacred balance between chaos and harmony. The pharaoh's job was to keep the sun rising, the river flowing, the enemies trembling, and the people grateful. No pressure. Oh, and did I mention your siblings might also be your spouses? Welcome to the royal family. You see, in an effort to keep the divine bloodline pure, pharaohs often married their sisters, half-sisters, or cousins. This wasn't some rare exception, it was the norm. Entire dynasties were crafted from intertwining limbs of the same family tree, and that tree often bore strange fruit. Some scholars suspect that the physical ailments seen in mummies' deformities, scoliosis, or oddly fused bones, may have been the price of keeping it all in the family. The royal children were divine, yes, but also occasionally limping, coughing, or born with conditions that even the gods couldn't heal. And through it all, they were expected to smile, to march in ceremonies, to pray at dawn, bless the harvest, and pretend that being pharaoh was the best job in the universe. But power, as it turns out, isn't always comfortable, especially when your enemies are everywhere, and some of them share your last name. Imagine waking up to a job where your morning checklist includes 1. Speaking to the gods, 2. Ensuring the agricultural cycle doesn't collapse, and 3. Surviving breakfast without being poisoned. This was the daily reality for a pharaoh. From the moment the light touched the lintels of their palace, the pharaoh's life was scheduled down to the sacred minute. Priests would greet him with incense and polished sandals, not out of affection, but out of necessity. Because the pharaoh wasn't just important, he was the hinge on which the entire universe swung. The rituals started early, before the people stirred, before the market stalls opened or scribes dipped their reeds in ink. The pharaoh would step into a temple, usually barefoot, and begin the slow, ceremonial awakening of the gods. Statues had to be cleansed, offerings placed just so, hymns sung in a specific order, incense waved until it clung to the rafters like holy fog. and none of it was optional. Because if the pharaoh missed a ritual or failed to offer the right words at the right time, he wasn't just slacking off. He was risking cosmic collapse, famine, plague, war. His personal sleep schedule was tethered to the turning of the stars. There is something bleakly funny about it all, about imagining this glittering Verona. Man so divine his name was carved into stone, forced to mumble morning prayers while still halfway asleep, a god yawning, a king with bed hair. The absurdity of divinity, but no one laughed, not aloud, because underneath all the ceremony was fear. Fear that chaos is fit would win, that the Nile wouldn't flood, the crops would fail, or the Hyksos would return. And in that fear, the pharaoh was a hostage, not a hero. If anything went wrong, the people didn't blame the weather, they blamed the king. And yet, he smiled. He waved from gilded balconies. He distributed bread and beer at festivals. He posed beside deities, carved in relief, always larger than life, always stepping with his left foot forward, the mark of forward momentum, even when he may have wanted to run. Behind those smiles, of course, there was another reality, a darker one. The court was a pressure cooker. Every advisor had a motive. Every general had ambition. Even the high priest of Amunor, supposed spiritual advisor, was just one whispered rumor away from becoming your rival. Some pharaohs didn't make it. They were found slumped in their beds, or mysteriously ill after a feast. Others were buried quickly and quietly, their names chiseled out, their statues smashed. To erase a pharaoh's name was to condemn him to a second death, the erasure of memory. But until that moment came, the show had to go on. You had to look serene, even if your stomach churned. You had to raise the crook and flail, symbols of kingship, even when your arms were tired. And you had to carry the world on your shoulders, even if those shoulders were only 15 years old. So yes, you were a god. But gods, as it turns out, don't get weekends off. It's a curious thing, really, how loneliness can flourish in a palace. One might think that with all the wives, concubines, servants, tutors, advisors, generals, scribes, and perfumed hangers-on, a pharaoh could never feel truly alone. But solitude isn't always about silence. Sometimes it's about never hearing the truth. Pharaohs were surrounded by people, yes, but not equals, not friends. They were reflections, not relationships. Mirrors trained to nod, bow, flatter, and report. And within that elaborate choreography of obedience, there was very little space for vulnerability, least of all within the royal family, because the royal family wasn't like other families. It was a dynasty engineered like a myth tit-knit by blood, tighter still by marriage. Sisters became wives, aunts became mothers, in-law and stepmothers in the same breath. Sometimes the same person filled all three roles. In trying to preserve divine lineage, they created a genetic loop that curled in on itself like a snake devouring its own tail. And that tail, it turns out, was bitter. Inbreeding had its costs, though the priests rarely admitted it. To suggest that divine blood might produce flawed children was heresy. But the evidence lies embalmed in linen and silence. Misshapen bones, club feet, elongated skulls. One pharaoh's spine curled sideways like a sickle. Another was found with a cleft palate and a bone disease that made walking nearly impossible. These weren't just individual tragedies. They were systemic, inevitable results of a crown that refused to dilute itself. And still, the weddings continued. Sometimes, a pharaoh would marry his sister, not out of desire, but duty, a symbolic union. Sometimes they were children, both of them, married on papyrus, long before they even understood what marriage meant. Other times, a pharaoh took multiple wives' political alliances wrapped in silk and ceremony, sealed with festivals and feasts. There were love stories, too, perhaps, quiet glances, secret poems, but we don't hear much about those. The records favored triumphs, conquests, piety, the pharaoh as a paragon, a builder of obelisks, a father to his people, not a boy forced to marry his sister while his heart beat for a musician in the court's shadows. And then there were the children. So many children, born of so many mothers, all with some claim, however small, to the throne, and each one a potential heir, or a potential rival, depending on who you asked. It must have been exhausting keeping track, not just of birthdays and names, but of loyalties, of who whispered to whom, of which child looked too long at the crown or practiced their speeches a little too confidently. There's a kind of paranoia that grows when your enemies share your blood. It's not just political, it's personal, and in the long corridors of palace life, it lingered like incense, sweet, cloying, and quietly choking. So no, the pharaoh was never truly alone, but he was rarely safe either. It always begins the same way, a slow turn of the head, a servant's silence that lasts a heartbeat too long, the clink of a cup just slightly off rhythm, the hush that follows when someone too important enters a room and no one dares exhale. Power, at its peak, is never quiet, it's haunted. By the New Kingdom, assassination had already woven itself into the royal vocabulary. Not officially, of course. Officially, every pharaoh died gloriously, in battle, or of old age, or of divine withdrawal, if nothing else fit. But the evidence, smeared faintly across tombs and trauma, tells a different story. Some were strangled, others bled out from wounds that no festival dagger should have inflicted. A few may have simply stopped breathing under mysterious circumstances, in rooms where only the trusted were allowed. There's the case of Ramesses III, a powerful king, beloved by his people, or so the wall carvings claimed, but his body when found had a deep gash across the throat, so clean and precise it could only have come from within his own household. A harem conspiracy, they called it. But that makes it sound almost salacious, theatrical. In truth, it was desperate. It was political. It was an inside job. The pharaoh's wives and sons, once wrapped in silks and ceremony, conspired to carve out their own place in the lineage. Not out of greed, necessarily, but survival, ambition, the awful mathematics of royal succession. You see, succession wasn't always clear. The eldest son wasn't guaranteed the throne. Favoritism, divine omens, or priestly politics could append the whole chart. And the more wives a pharaoh had, the more tangled the possibilities became. A son born to a lesser wife might spend his life watching a more politically convenient brother get groomed for rule. And sometimes that weight curdled into action. Daggers in the night, poison in the pomegranate juice, whispered plans carved into secret scrolls, hidden behind false walls in temple libraries. It's easy to imagine them, those conspirators, slipping barefoot through stone corridors, the scent of myrrh still clinging to their robes, faces half-lit by torchlight, hearts pounding, hoping the guards could be bribed, the gods distracted, the story spun just right. And then there were those who never needed to lift a blade, who simply watched and waited as the pharaoh sickened mysteriously, a little each day, until his steps faltered, until his prayers grew slurred, until the embalmers were summoned before anyone dared speak the truth. It wasn't just men, either. Queens held power too. Hatshepsut, for instance, ruled not as queen, but as Pharaoh herself, wore the beard, claimed the divinity, ordered temples built in her name. But even her memory was later defaced, her statues smashed, her name scraped from monuments. The throne, it seemed, had room for only one ghost at a time. So pharaohs walked through life, flanked by guards, watched by spies, flattered by poets who might have kissed their feet at dawn and slipped a curse under their pillow by dusk. And all the while, the kingdom watched the sun rise and fall, unaware of the quiet civil wars behind palace doors. And yet, in all their fear, pharaohs did have one great consolation: death, but not the way you or I might think of it. For most people in ancient Egypt, death was an ending softened by familiarity. It was expected, planned for, ritualized. You died, your family mourned, the village carried on. Maybe you were buried in a modest grave, maybe a tomb if you were lucky. You hoped your name would be spoken now and then, so your soul wouldn't vanish completely. But for a pharaoh, death was not a release. It was a performance, a deadline, a celestial to-do list. Because dying was only the beginning of his second job, immortality, and that ... was expensive. A pharaoh had to be buried in a way befitting a god, which meant tombs the size of small cities, gold that gleamed like the sun, spells from the Book of the Dead carefully painted in cobalt blue and blood red across every available inch of stone, organs removed and stored in alabaster jars, the heart weighed against a feather, the soul judged by a tribunal of gods who didn't care how many obelisks you commissioned if you'd lived like a tyrant. So the planning started early, sometimes as early as childhood. Even a boy king, just crowned, would begin designing his tomb. His priests would start compiling his funerary texts. His artisans would sketch scenes of triumph. He hadn't lived yet, battles won, lands ruled, gods appeased. Because to die unprepared was to risk oblivion. They believed that without the right words, charms, offerings, and architecture, a pharaoh's soul might get lost on the journey to the afterlife, might be eaten by a demon, or judged unworthy, or worse, forgotten. Which brings us to the strangest part of all. For rulers obsessed with legacy, for men who carved their names into every pillar and column, so many of them were lost, swallowed by the desert, their tombs looted, their stories buried, entire dynasties reduced to rubble, reassembled centuries later by archaeologists with more questions than answers. The Valley of the Kings, for instance, is littered with broken promises. Tombs ransacked within decades of burial, bodies moved, coffins stolen, gold melted down, sacred names erased or rewritten. Only a few remained untouched. Tutankhamun, famously, a minor pharaoh, barely remembered in his own time. But his tomb, missed by looters, preserved by accident, sparked a frenzy in ours. And what did we find? A boy surrounded by treasures, too heavy to carry alone. A cane beside his bed, malaria in his bones, a curved spine, a fractured leg, a rushed burial. All that wealth, all that ceremony, and he still limped through life, still died young, still needed help walking through the underworld. So maybe that's the final truth, the haunting punchline. Even the most powerful men in history couldn't escape the human condition, couldn't outrun time, couldn't ensure peace in life or in death. But oh, how they tried. Let's stay a while longer in that silence. The kind of silence that lives in temples, that clings to stone columns painted with stories, that drips from ceilings where the stars are carved into gold leaf, each one shaped like a prayer that never quite made it home. Being pharaoh meant speaking to the gods every day, Not metaphorically, literally. You were their mouthpiece, their chosen vessel, their living conduit. When you spoke, it was said they listened. When you made an offering, the cosmos adjusted itself accordingly. But what happens when the gods don't answer? When the fields don't yield? When the Nile refuses to flood? When the locusts arrive early and stay late? You don't blame the gods, you blame the middleman. There are records, faded but sharp, of famines, of entire regions crumbling under the weight of drought and bad omens, crops failing 3 seasons in a row, markets collapsing, mothers trading amulets for flour, and all of it landing, like ash, at the feet of the Pharaoh. Sometimes it wasn't even his fault. A volcano halfway across the world could cloud the sky, cool the climate, choke the rains. But the people didn't know that, couldn't know that. All they knew was that something was wrong, and the divine machinery wasn't working. So the Pharaoh stood in the temple, barefoot on polished stone, reciting hymns older than the language itself, calling down blessings, offering sacrifices, hundreds of cattle, jars of honey, flowers, beer, perfumed oil that had to be imported from the edge of the known world, all in the hopes that anything would shift. But the gods were quiet, and silence, to a man trained his entire life to believe in cosmic dialogue, was agony. Worse, it was treasonous. There were priests who whispered that the Pharaoh had failed, that his blood had weakened, that the gods had turned their faces away. You could feel the loyalty tremble in the temples like a cracked obelisk still upright, but leaning. A particularly bad famine could ruin a reign, could spark rebellion, could prompt someone to find a new heir, a more pious prince, a clearer vessel. And then the Pharaoh would discover that the line between godhood and blame was not a line at all. It was a thin thread, and it frayed in the dark. He might double the sacrifices, triple them, strip his own palaces for gold to melt down and offer to Amen. He might fast, he might weep, he might walk barefoot into the desert and beg. Still, the river might not rise. Still, the gods might not speak. And he would stand there, the man in the crown, surrounded by incense, cloaked in ritual, while the people looked at him not with reverence, but with hunger. There's a myth that powerful men sleep well, that once you've secured your throne, your riches, your deity status, and your 1,000-year legacy, the nights are peaceful. That you lie down on linen sheets woven by virgins, your head cradled by scented cushions, and drift into dreams of lotus blossoms and obedient stars. But that isn't how sleep works. Not even for a pharaoh, especially not for a pharaoh, because even gods have nightmares, and theirs tend to be real. Imagine the dreams of a man who carries a kingdom on his chest like a golden weight, who is told day after day that he is beloved, eternal. Flawless Anne knows that half the people saying it are plotting how to end him. Imagine the way the brain twists under pressure like that, what shadows it starts to cast across its own temples. There were likely dreams of drowning, of being pulled into the Nile by unseen hands, of sand filling the lungs, of jackals whispering in courtier voices, of tombs crumbling before they could be sealed, of faces he trusted turning into masks, and masks that smiled too long. There were whispers in the dark, even when no one else was in the room. No pharaoh slept alone. There were guards at the door, eunuchs in the hallway, sometimes wives curled beside him, but none of them could protect him from what came at night. The gnawing ache of uncertainty, the regret for orders given in haste, the memory of a child punished too harshly, the sickly fear that maybe, just maybe, the gods weren't listening because they had turned away. The pharaoh's bed was not a sanctuary. It was a stage. Even here, in the hours meant for rest, ceremony crept in. The bed was carved with protective spells, the linens embroidered with holy symbols, the room arranged according to celestial geometry, as if architecture could fend off guilt. And still he woke sweating, and still he checked the door, the window, the tray of food, the water basin. Even gods get paranoid. The irony is cruel. The one man in all of Egypt with the power to order dreams interpreted, to build temples, to speak directly to the divine, was also the one most plagued by doubt. The stakes were too high, the lines too blurry, and the body, divine or not, needs sleep. But sleep doesn't always come, not to men like him. So maybe he wandered down hallways of scented darkness, past still burning torches, past statues of himself he barely recognized. Maybe he whispered to the gods in private, in his own voice, not the one taught to him by priests. Maybe he begged them, "Tell me I'm doing it right. Just once, say something back." But the gods don't speak that way. And sleep, when it finally arrived, came not as a friend but a thief, stealing hours, stealing peace, stealing the certainty that tomorrow would rise with the same obedient sun. Let's shift for a moment to the men who built the dreams. Because every pharaoh, no matter how paranoid, how exhausted, how quietly desperate, needed one thing above all else: permanence. That meant stone. That meant legacy. That meant a building project so vast, so impossible, that it would outlast memory itself. A monument that could be seen from the afterlife, lit by stars no one had named yet. And so the Pharaoh summoned his architects, not poets, not priests, but builders. Practical men with sun-split lips and calloused palms who were told, in the gentlest voice possible, to make immortality out of limestone. It sounds noble, doesn't it? But here's the truth. Every monument begins with a lie. A lie that this man is forever, that his face deserves to be carved higher than the gods, that his victories were flawless, that the statues of him should be 20 feet tall when he stood barely 5, that the inscriptions should tell stories of triumph, not tax shortages or plagues. The royal architect didn't just shape stone. He shaped memory. He decided how the pharaoh would be seen, what the gods would remember, what future generations would believe. That took more than chisels. That took imagination. He drew lines across sand and said, Here is where we will prove the divine right of kingship using geometry and slave labor." And the pharaoh nodded, half-listening eyes already turned skyward. Did it matter that his treasury was empty, that his people murmured in the markets, that the embalmers were beginning to ask quiet questions about where, exactly, he wanted his tomb to be? Not yet. Because as long as something was being built, as long as there was scaffolding against the sky and the sound of hammers echoing through the valley, he could pretend, they could all pretend, that he was still in control. The temples grew like forests of stone, pylons carved with victories he hadn't yet won, halls filled with statues of himself, kneeling before gods who, in truth, never knelt to him. Entire walls covered in offerings he could no longer afford. But what mattered was the illusion. To stop building was to admit death. To stop carving was to concede that the story was over. And so the workers worked. The priests blessed the foundations. The architects adjusted their measurements for another season, knowing that the pharaoh would likely not live to see it finished. That was always the secret. None of these monuments were for the living. They were for us. For the ones who would wander through their ruins thousands of years later, trying to imagine what it must have felt like to be so terrified of being forgotten that you tried to chisel your soul into stone. And for a while, it worked. But then the sand came, and then the silence, and then even the lies began to crumble. Imagine, if you can, a decree written in ink that no longer exists, on papyrus that has long since dissolved into dust. It once commanded the construction of a sacred road, perhaps, or the redistribution of grain during a famine, or the punishment of a court official whose loyalty had shifted a fraction too far to the left. Now it is gone, as if it never existed. But the consequences, the road, the famine, the punishment, this is the strange condition of power, that it must be both absolute and invisible, that it must leave evidence, but never explanation, that it must endure even after the hand that signed it has withered into dust. Pharaohs issued edicts with the weight of divine law. A gesture, a word, a symbol etched on a tablet, and reality shifted. A village renamed, a god demoted, a death authorized with a flick of the stylus. But time, it turns out, cares little for titles. The decrees faded. The papyrus crumbled. The tablets broke. What remains are fragments, bits of granite too heavy to move, too sacred to destroy. Lines of hieroglyphs interrupted by centuries of wind and misinterpretation. A lion-headed goddess here, a crocodile-shaped tax rate there, a half-finished statue's shoulder emerging from the sand like an accusation. For every name that has survived, there are 100 that haven't. Pharaohs who ruled for decades, whose armies conquered cities, whose temples blotted out the sun, now reduced to a cartouche no one quite agrees how to pronounce. And isn't that a kind of justice? That the greatest men of their age are now no more than syllables on a museum plaque. That their divine mandates are stored in climate-controlled drawers next to items labeled unknown purpose. It humbles, doesn't it? And it reminds us softly, almost kindly, that power, for all its rituals and regalia, is no more permanent than the ink it was written in. But in the Pharaoh's lifetime, none of this was known. He believed his laws would endure, that his justice would echo across generations, that his reign would be cited by future kings as the Golden Age. He didn't know that the next dynasty would sand off his name and replace it with their own, that his face would be recarved into a stranger's likeness, that the goddess he praised would fall out of favor, her temple repurposed as a stable. And so he decreed, with confidence, with ceremony, with all the gravitas a man could muster while dressed in gold leaf and linen. But the desert was already waiting, already folding his words into silence, already drawing up the winds that would carry his empire, piece by piece, back into the dust. There is something haunting about a prayer that no longer has a listener. In the temples of Karnak and Luxor, if you press your ear against the stone, you might almost hear them still, the chants of 100 priests echoing upward into vaults carved with stars, the rhythmic percussion of palm sticks, the muttered syllables of ancient tongues lost somewhere between poetry and obligation. Every day, for centuries, these rituals unfolded with clockwork precision, an entire priestly caste devoted to the maintenance of divine favor. The offerings, the ablutions, the invocations, a chorus of human breath directed upward, toward gods who never once interrupted. The Pharaoh, of course, was central to this, not just as participant, but as subject. The prayers were for him, and through him, and sometimes, if the theology twisted just right about him, his name was spoken as a charm, his virtues catalogued like ingredients in a spell. He was protector, shepherd, builder, father, son of Ra, lord of two lands, golden falcon, master of balance. He was both man and myth, tangled into a knot of expectation no mortal could ever untie. But here's the tragedy. When the temples fell silent, no one noticed right away. There was no great collapse, just a fading, a gradual erosion of urgency. One priest died, then another. A drought lasted too long. A war redirected the kingdom's attention. Gold ran out. A rival cult gained popularity. The next king favored a different god. And suddenly, the offerings stopped. The sanctuaries were locked. The incense dried to powder. The statues gathered dust. The gods, once an audience of flame and eternity, stood mute in the dark. But the Pharaoh's name remained etched into the walls. Even after the language was forgotten, it endured. Even after the prayers lost their meaning, the names still gleamed. Paint peeled, stone cracked, empires fell and still they endured. A kind of immortality. Not the kind he imagined, not the glory of endless devotion, but something quieter, stranger. His name, pronounced by scholars in rooms lit by fluorescent bulbs, by tourists in wide-brimmed hats and sensible shoes, by children flipping through books with pictures of golden masks and jackal-headed gods. Not reverence. Not exactly, but not silence either. It's a soft kind of survival. The Pharaoh, long dead, long buried, long stripped of power and divinity, still lives in the breath of strangers, in mispronunciations, in museum whispers, in bedtime stories. The gods may have turned their faces, the people may have forgotten his laws, but someone, somewhere, still says his name, and maybe that's enough. The Pharaoh was both everything and nothing. Everything, because his image was on every temple wall. His names, there were 5 of them, always were inscribed in sacred cartouches, protected by serpents, kissed by gods. He was the sun incarnate, the heart of Egypt, the one whose gaze could burn crops or bless cities. Nothing, because without the rituals, without the robes, without the stage, he was just a man. And sometimes, not even a particularly healthy one. There's something cruelly comical in the contrast. The crown weighed several pounds, made of real gold, shaped to sit just right, with the Euroscobra poised to strike jutting from the forehead. Intimidating, sacred, uncomfortable. The sandals, also gold, not meant for walking, just for dying in. It's a strange flex, wearing shoes you can't use. But that was the point. Pharaohs were symbols first, bodies second. Their comfort mattered less than their appearance. And so the regalia accumulated: collars, scepters, headdresses, kilts, tailpieces, all designed not to function, but to transform. He couldn't bend easily, couldn't sweat visibly, couldn't fall off a chariot or flinch at an eclipse. Because gods don't trip. Gods don't blink. Gods don't get sand in their eyes and cry about it. So the Pharaoh trained, learned the poses, the voice, the posture. There was likely an entire curriculum for divinity. How to hold the crook, when to raise the flail, which god to name first, in which season. How to stand during the Hub festival, a kind of royal renewal ceremony where the king ran not really for sport, but to prove he still could. Imagine that, being a living deity and still needing to run laps to keep your job. Of course, sometimes the Pharaoh was too old, or too sick, or too dead to participate. In those cases, the priests would arrange a symbolic run, a performance. Someone, maybe even the king's own son, would complete it on his behalf. Everyone clapped, everyone bowed, everyone ignored the obvious. The Pharaoh wasn't immortal. Not really, just ceremonially, and underneath all the divine iconography was a man made of clay, like anyone else, with bones that ached, teeth that cracked, a digestive system that could and did go terribly wrong. We know this because the mummies tell us, through the radiologists and the autopsies, through the hair analysis and the ancient fractures. The great Thutmose III had a severe back issue. Ramesses II had abscessed teeth so bad they likely made him miserable for years. Amenhotep III had arthritis in nearly every joint. Akhenaten, well, we'll get to him. He may have been the most human of them all, but they kept showing up, kept blessing the crops, kept posing for reliefs where their muscles looked like they were carved from cedar, not cartilage, kept pretending that the crown didn't press too hard, that the sandals didn't chafe, that the divine spotlight wasn't slowly burning them down to the wick. Because once you admit that God is tired, you have to start asking who's really holding up the sky. Let us pause for just a moment with the strangest pharaoh of them all, Akhenaten, the heretic, the outlier, the one who tried against thousands of years of tradition to rewrite the rules of the divine. He ruled in the mid-14th century before Common Era, during Egypt's Golden Age, and he did something that, to this day, scholars still argue over with a mix of admiration, confusion, and disbelief. He changed the gods, not added a new one, not elevated a lesser deity, not tweaked the existing mythos. He got rid of almost all of them. In their place, he introduced Aten, a sun disk, not even a proper god in the traditional sense, no animal head, no personality, no myths, just radiant energy, light itself, abstract and all-encompassing. And Akhenaten, previously Amenhotep IV, renamed himself to reflect this devotion. He built a new city from scratch, called it Akhetaten, and declared it the capital. He moved the court, the temples, the artists. He shut down the worship of Amun, dismantled the priesthoods, closed sacred sites. Imagine that. One man, standing against 2,000 years of tradition. It must have been exhilarating. It must have been terrifying. The arts changed. Suddenly, pharaohs were no longer statues of perfection. Akhenaten was depicted with a long face, a sagging belly, wide hips. His wife, Nefertiti, was shown not as a silent consort, but active, dynamic, almost equal. His daughters danced beneath the rays of Aten, their little fingers reaching toward the ends of sunbeams. There was something intimate, even tender, about this vision, but also isolated. Aten had no myth, no stories, no priests outside the pharaoh's control. There was no divine narrative to cling to, only light, only the moment, only the king and his god, locked in a private communion that no one else quite understood. And when famine came, when enemies tested the borders, when the people hungered for the rituals they'd known since birth, they did not cry out to Aten, they remembered Amun, and after Akhenaten died likely in his early 30s, his city was abandoned. His reforms reversed. His name scraped from history with the same zeal he had once used to erase others. His tomb was modest, unfinished. His vision, so radical, so human, so achingly sincere, lasted barely 2 decades. But in that brief flicker, Akhenaten gave us something the other pharaohs rarely dared to show: himself. Not just the god mask, not the conqueror, but the thinker, the dreamer, the man who believed that maybe, just maybe, the divine was simpler than we thought, that maybe all we needed was sunlight. But sunlight fades. And by the time Tutankhamen, his son or nephew, or both, took the throne, Aten was gone. The temples were reopened. The old gods returned. and the heretic city crumbled under the weight of too much sky. And then came the boy, Tutankhamun. The name drips with gold now, but in his time he was barely more than a placeholder. A soft-spoken teenager thrust into a role vacated too suddenly, too violently, and too recently by a father or uncle who had nearly broken the country in half. He became Pharaoh around the age of 9. When most children were learning how to read or play board games, he was being trained to stabilize a religious fracture that even grown men didn't understand. He was dressed in gold, paraded as a symbol of divine restoration, and told gently, one hopes to undo everything Akhenaten had done. His name had once been Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten, but was changed to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun, to signal his return to orthodoxy. He was married to his half-sister, as custom dictated. He was surrounded by advisors, older men, shrewd and watchful, who likely ruled in his name, while he learned how to sit still during hours of ceremonial recitation. He was a boy in a gilded cage, the face of an empire in recovery, and his body was failing him. Modern scans of his mummy reveal a life riddled with pain, a clubbed foot, malaria, bone disorders, perhaps even a degenerative disease. His hips were twisted. He required a cane, of which several were found in his tomb, well used, not decorative. Imagine that. A god on earth, hobbling, and he died young, around 19. Just as he might have begun to understand the rhythms of rule, he was gone. The cause remains debated: a broken leg, an infection, an autoimmune disease. Some speculate he was murdered, but it may be more mundane than that. The body, already fragile, simply gave out. And yet, his death was perhaps the greatest gift he could have given history, because his tomb was forgotten, not desecrated, not looted, just missed, hidden beneath layers of debris, swallowed by time, saved by accident. And when it was opened in 1922, more than 3,000 years later, it exploded into modern consciousness like a myth reborn. The treasures were staggering: a chariot, thrones, jewelry, a golden death mask so radiant it seemed to sing. Suddenly, Tutankhamun, who in life had been a footnote, was everywhere, on magazine covers, in museums, in whispered legends of curses and haunted archaeologists. But what lingers most, if you look past the gold, is how small everything is. The tomb isn't grand. It's cramped, rushed, painted in haste. The burial was likely unplanned. His sarcophagus was almost too big for the chamber. There are signs that objects were repurposed from others' funerals. It all happened fast, because death waits for no one, not even gods, especially not gods. So Tutankhamun, the boy pharaoh, became eternal not through rule or wisdom or war, but by accident. And in that accident, we saw, perhaps for the first time, the vulnerability of kings, the child beneath the crown, the limp behind the legend, the quiet truth that even the most divine of rulers can be forgotten for 3 millennia and still return to remind us that legacy isn't always earned. Sometimes it's just left behind. Pharaohs built with stone because they feared paper. Stone endures, they thought. Stone cannot be edited, cannot be whispered against, cannot be burned in a jealous fit or tossed into the Nile when the winds shift. Paper, well, paper betrays. But the funny thing is, it was paper, not pyramids, that undid them. Papyrus, to be precise. Egypt's early bureaucracy was among the most sophisticated on earth. Taxes, grain tallies, temple inventories, marriage contracts, even breakups, everything was written down. Not in sacred ink for the gods, but in practical strokes for the scribes. The real empire wasn't built by masons. It was built by bureaucrats hunched over reed pens, cataloguing every sack of barley, every cow, every copper tool requisitioned for tomb construction. They were everywhere, these scribes, sitting cross-legged in shadowed courtyards, in the corners of temples, at the back of palaces, silent and deadly, not with daggers, but with records. And in those records, we glimpse what the stone won't tell us: that Pharaoh's grain quotas were slipping in Lower Egypt, that his general in the north was late reporting back, that a temple servant was caught stealing offerings meant for the god while invoking the Pharaoh's name. These were the paper cuts that bled dynasties dry, because no matter how grand the statue, no matter how divine the ceremony, the real work of empire happened in margins, in daily ledgers, in quiet corruption, in trade routes gone sour, in water levels meticulously noted, year after year, until the trend pointed to drought and then, inevitably, to blame, and the Pharaoh. He was often the last to know. Or perhaps he knew and chose not to see. After all, to acknowledge that your empire runs on the thin fibers of swamp reeds, not celestial decree, is to admit how fragile the whole performance is. And yet, the scribes remembered. They left behind complaints, letters, jokes, even one famously scrawled a note about a shipment of beer being late, and implied, with dry sarcasm, that the gods would not be pleased. We read these things now and smile, forgetting that behind each word was a system groaning under the weight of its own myth. Even the scribes, careful and reverent, knew the truth, that kings are not made of granite, they are made of paperwork. And while stone may outlast fire, it is paper that records how the fire started. So when you wonder why a pharaoh fell not just one, but the whole line of the myth, helps to look not at the statues they left behind, but at the scrolls they tried to bury. The grain was short, the border was breached, the gods were silent. And somewhere in the back of a temple office, a scribe dipped his pen and wrote, "The Pharaoh has not responded." In the golden age of Egypt, gods were not distant. They were not concepts. They were not silent figures in the sky. They ate daily, and the Pharaoh fed them. That was, perhaps, one of his most sacred duties, to keep the gods full. Each day, the temples roared to life before dawn. Priests bathed the statues in perfumed water, dressed them in fresh linens, adorned them with jewelry, and most importantly brought them food: baskets of bread, cuts of meat, jars of honey, beer, fruit, incense, of course, mountains of it. The offerings were elaborate, excessive, theatrical. The gods did not eat literally, not in a way we'd understand, but the act, the gesture, was necessary. If you didn't feed them, they might not protect the land, might not keep the sun rising, might not bless the Pharaoh's reign. And so the temples became kitchens, not figuratively, literally. Behind the sanctuaries, there were storerooms, bakeries, breweries. Thousands of workers prepared the divine meals each day. Cattle were slaughtered, bread baked, beer brewed, fish dried in the sun. It was a holy supply chain, one that required farms, taxes, transport, and a staggering amount of logistical oversight, all under the Pharaoh's divine sponsorship. Because if the gods weren't pleased, the people would suffer. And if the people suffered, they'd look to the Pharaoh and ask why the divine contracts had failed. You could survive a war, you could survive a drought, but you could not survive the gods going hungry. So, as temples grew richer, more lavish, more central to public life, the Pharaoh found himself in a strange position, less ruler of the people and more servant to the divine pantry. He offered gold, yes, but also grain. He conquered foreign lands, but only to bring back more incense for Amon's altar. He funded festivals, but often to appease gods with very specific dietary preferences. It sounds absurd, perhaps, feeding stone statues, measuring the god's satisfaction in smoke. But religion was never about logic. It was about fear, and hope, and repetition. And in that cycle, the pharaoh spun endlessly. A king who spent more time in temples than on thrones, who prayed for good harvests, not for his people's sake, but because without them, the offerings would thin, and the gods might notice. It is ironic, of course. The gods, said to be eternal and unchanging, had stomachs that needed daily appeasement, and the pharaoh, supposedly divine himself, spent his days fetching for deities who never spoke, never moved, never so much as said thank you. That is perhaps the saddest joke of all. That the most powerful man in the world spent his life feeding others who could not eat, while his people quietly starved outside the temple walls. By the time the pharaoh died officially, ceremonially, he had already been half dead for years. Because the process of godhood was gradual, exhausting, and curiously impersonal. When the priests prepared his burial, they didn't just embalm a body, they embalmed a role, a title, a symbol. The person was beside the point. Flesh became artifact. Name became myth. The pharaoh ceased to be a father, a son, a man, and became Osiris, ruler of the dead. There was a checklist. First, remove the organs, all but the heart, unless you believe the occasional embalmer who removed that too, by accident or out of superstition. Closing parenthesis. Then dry the body in natron salt, pulled from the desert like the earth's own weeping. 40 days, maybe longer, than the wrappings. Linen upon linen, soaked in resin, spells whispered between layers, amulets tucked beside fingers, eyes replaced with stones that never blink. And through all this, the mask was prepared. That golden face, you know the one. It gleams across history books and museum exhibits. High cheekbones, almond eyes, a calm that borders on indifferent. It is always beautiful. It is never accurate. The mask was not a portrait, it was a promise. An idealized version of the pharaoh in changing, serene, divine. It was meant to fool the gods in the afterlife, to ensure the soul would be recognized, accepted, and guided safely through the duat, the realm of the dead. But in doing so, it erased the man. No wrinkles, no scars, no limp, no fear, just an icon. And this is where it gets strangely modern, because we still do this, don't we? We polish our dead, we edit their legacies, we smooth the edges, crop out the pain, in funerals, in eulogies, in memory. We rarely bury the truth, we bury the best version of it, the version we can live with. The pharaoh's mask is the original filter, a perfect face for an imperfect life. And perhaps that's why they built such elaborate tombs, because somewhere, beneath all that performance, they feared being forgotten as they really were. Not as gods, but as men. The tombs were not just houses for the afterlife, they were arguments, proof, evidence that this person had mattered, had ruled, had suffered and triumphed and decreed and wept in silence when the stars failed to answer. So they built deep, and they buried well, and they wrapped themselves in gold, not to show off, but to leave a trail, to say, follow this brightness, I was here. But gold to dims, and masks, no matter how finely made, eventually fall from the face. Let's linger now in the dark. Not metaphorically, not poetically, literally, deep underground, in the heart of the Theban cliffs, where the tombs of pharaohs were carved like secret cathedrals, where silence had weight, and every step echoed like a warning. Here, in the Valley of the Kings, eternity was supposed to begin. But eternity, it turns out, is an open invitation. And the pharaohs, for all their wealth, for all their guards, for all their curses and holy seals, could not keep the living from visiting the dead. The tomb robbers came early, sometimes within months of burial, maybe even days. No matter how well hidden the tomb, no matter how cursed the air was made to feel, greed finds a way. It always does. They weren't cartoonish villains with torches and shovels. They were often workers, men who had helped build the tombs, who knew the layout, who knew which doors were fake, which seals were real, and how to avoid the traps if there even were any. They moved quietly, fast, efficient, not for the gold statues, not at first, but for the small things, the amulets, the inlays, the jars of perfumed oil worth more than livestock, the linen itself, soaked in resin and rumor. And they weren't always strangers. Sometimes the guards were complicit, sometimes the priests, sometimes even members of the royal family, fallen on hard times, watching the new dynasty rewrite the names on temple walls and thinking, what does it matter? The pharaoh had died with a promise that his tomb would remain untouched, his name eternal, his rest unbroken. But the sand shifts, the empire weakens, the gods grow quiet, and the lock cracks open. There are trial records, papyrus scrolls from the 20th dynasty describing tomb robberies with the weary detail of bureaucrats who know they're fighting a losing battle. Names of thieves, testimonies of servants, inventories of what was stolen and what was left. Sometimes the robbers were executed, sometimes exiled, but mostly the cycle continued. One pharaoh buried, another tomb found empty. Another king builds deeper, higher, more elaborate, but nothing is safe. Even Ramesses, the great hero of temples, master of monuments, had to be moved. His mummy was reburied in a hidden cache with other royals, like someone hiding family heirlooms in a closet before burglars return. There's something darkly human in it. These god kings, with all their power, all their prayers, reduced to a game of hide-and-seek with the very people they once ruled. And what did the robbers see in those tombs? They saw the truth, the fragile bones, the faded paint, the desperate measures. They saw, perhaps more than anyone, that the pharaoh was never truly divine, just a man in a mask, just another body in the dark. In ancient Egyptian belief, death happened twice. The first was physical. The moment the breath stopped, the eyes closed, the body cooled. This death was inevitable, but manageable. Rituals handled it. Embalmers addressed it. Priests could smooth its edges with spells and ceremony. But the second death was worse. It came when the name was forgotten, when no one spoke it, when no offerings were made, when no one remembered who you were, what you did, where you had been buried, when your image faded from stone and the stories stopped being told. Then only then did you truly vanish. For a pharaoh, this second death was the ultimate fear, more terrifying than tomb robbers or foreign invaders, because this death wasn't physical, it was erasure, a vanishing from time itself, and sometimes it was intentional. Damnatio memoria, the condemnation of memory. When a pharaoh fell out of favor, when a new dynasty rose, or a new religion took hold, the past was rewritten. Names were chipped off walls, faces were carved away, statues pulled down and repurposed. The old king didn't just die, he was deleted. Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, even Tutankhamun, briefly. All targets of memories, eraser. Their images reworked, their names scratched out. To erase a name was to kill again. But sometimes the opposite happened. Sometimes a name too powerful refused to stay buried. Ramesses II, for instance, became legend. His image appeared everywhere. He was exaggerated in memory, mythologized into grandeur, even beyond what he had claimed for himself. His name became shorthand for kingship. Even the Greek centuries later heard whispers of a mighty pharaoh and folded him into their stories. He did not die the second death, not yet, but most did. Most pharaohs are known to us now only because archaeologists found a scrap of cartouche, a half-erased mural, a brittle papyrus. Even then, the details blur. One reign fades into another. Their deeds, their laws, their voices gone, and so we piece them together with tweezers and guesses. We call them by names that aren't quite theirs. We reconstruct their lives with fragments and footnotes. Sometimes we resurrect them briefly when we say their names aloud on a quiet night. Maybe just before bed, when the air is still and the lights are low. But for most, the second death has already come. And perhaps that's why they built so much, wrote so much, lied so grandly, not because they feared death, but because they feared being unremembered. Because in the end, even a pharaoh just wants what we all want: to be seen, to be heard, to be missed. By the end of the new kingdom, even the gods seemed weary. They no longer roared with the confidence of empire. Their temples, once vibrant with offerings and processionals, now echoed with hollow rituals and shrinking crowds. The priests still chanted, the incense still burned, but something had shifted. The pharaohs knew it. You can see it in their monuments, less ambitious, more defensive. In their tombs, smaller, rushed. In the records, fewer grand conquests, more local squabbles, more appeals to order that never quite arrives. The gods, once cosmic choreographers, became bureaucratic burdens. Worship itself became a kind of maintenance, a fading echo of what once was. The temples of Ammon still functioned, yes, but more as power centers than places of awe. The high priests of Thebes began to rival the pharaohs themselves, hoarding wealth, writing laws, commanding armies. The lines blurred. Sometimes the priests were kings. Sometimes the kings were just ceremonial priests, and the gods watched, or didn't. It's hard to say, because when a society begins to collapse, it rarely does so with thunder. It happens in tired decrees, in late taxes, in breadlines, in subtle changes in how often people show up to pray. Imagine a pharaoh standing in a once sacred hall, his voice echoing against walls that no longer seemed to listen. The gods carved into those walls, Osiris, Horus, Isis still looked down with perfect calm. But calm is not comfort. Calm is indifference. The pharaoh might ask, "Are you still there?" But stone doesn't answer. And the gods, once so immediate, so loud, so woven into every breath of Egyptian life, had become distant. Perhaps they were tired too. Perhaps they had heard too many prayers. Perhaps they had watched too many pharaohs rise and fall, declaring himself divine, each making the same mistakes, each buried in gold and worry. Or perhaps the people had changed, not in what they needed, but in what they believed could deliver it. New ideas crept in, new deities, foreign gods, a taste for the unfamiliar. Egyptian religion had always been expansive, absorbing the pantheons of neighbors, the rites of conquerors. But now, the absorption felt less like expansion and more like erosion. The divine tapestry frayed, and the Pharaoh, still expected to be the living god, found himself playing to an audience that no longer clapped. A stage where the lights had dimmed. A script that no longer matched the world around it. And so the Pharaoh continued out of duty or inertia, or simply because no one knew what else to do. The gods still needed feeding. The rituals still needed performing, even if no one was sure the gods were hungry anymore. In the final centuries of Egyptian independence, the Pharaoh's world began to shrink. Not physically, Egypt was still vast, still fertile, still rich in monuments, but spiritually, cosmically, the center no longer held. The divine machinery that once ticked in harmony began to misfire, sputter, stall. Pharaohs became shorter-lived, reigns turned turbulent, dynasties stacked and collapsed like fragile towers of papyrus. The once immovable sense of eternal order began to feel more like memory than mandate, but still they buried in gold. Even in decline, Egypt remained committed to the aesthetics of divinity. Even when resources were scarce, even when tomb robbers grew bolder and priests grew richer than kings, the rituals endured. A pharaoh might be powerless in life, a figurehead caught between generals and treasurers, but in death he was still rendered sacred, still wrapped, still painted, still sealed. And sometimes, though rarely, he was even buried in 3 nested coffins, the innermost of pure gold, inscribed with spells that promised rebirth, renewal, a sunrise that would never end. There's something heartbreaking in that. A society so determined to honor its myths that it continued the pageantry even as the script unraveled. You wonder if the artisans knew, if the man polishing the death mask understood the futility of his labor, if the embalmer, stuffing the nostrils with linen, had heard rumors that the Persians were coming, if the scribe, copying the Book of the Dead onto tomb walls, had ever paused and thought, will anyone ever read this again? But still, they did it, because that's what you do. When everything else falls apart, you keep the rituals, you light the incense, you sing the songs, you carve the name, even when the king is weak, even when the gods are silent, even when your own children have started to worship in different languages. Because if the pharaoh does not rise in the afterlife, then none of this meant anything. And so the final kings of Egypt, men with Greek names, Libyan ancestry, Ethiopian allies, still wrapped themselves in the imagery of Horus, still held the crook and flail, still claimed descent from Ra, even as foreign powers crept closer, even as temples fell into disuse, even as the Nile continued to rise and fall with ancient indifference. One day, the tombs were sealed for the last time. One day, the desert covered the entrances. One day, the wind stopped speaking their names. But inside those tombs, the pharaohs lay waiting, in gold, in silence, in hope. Because maybe, just maybe, someone would remember. Every pharaoh believed he could master time, and who could blame them? They controlled the calendar, the festivals, the seasons. Even the movement of the stars was bent to match their story. They were not just kings, they were cosmic regulators. Time, in their world, was a loop, a cycle, a sacred repetition of birth, death, rebirth, of Nile floods, harvests, an eternal return. But time is not a servant, it is a patient hunter. And so we arrive at one of the quieter ironies of pharaonic power. The pharaohs didn't actually know how long they would be remembered. They planned for forever, but they died before they could know how little of it they'd get. Take the story of the solar temples. Vast complexes built to honor the sun god Ra, constructed to capture and freeze a moment in the divine orbit. These temples were less about worship and more about synchronization, aligning kingly rule with celestial certainty. A pharaoh might spend half his reign building one, believing that, by aligning his legacy with the sun, he would glow across the ages. But only a few survived, and even fewer were completed, because the sun moves, the people change, and time, ever impartial, wears away its stone. The priests measured it carefully, with sundials, with water clocks, with temple shadows that crept like serpents across polished floors, and still they could not slow it. Still, they could not stop the inevitable blur between one reign and the next, one tomb and another, one name and its erasure. What we often forget is that pharaohs, for all their grandeur, were deeply afraid of irrelevance. They wanted their deeds inscribed, their lineage celebrated, their piety witnessed, their afterlife assured. But even as they planned for eternity, they feared the in-between, that soft, dreadful place between death and remembrance. That stretch of time when the tomb is sealed but not yet discovered, when the soul waits, nameless. And so they built timers into their legacy, calendars of festivals, rituals that repeated on anniversaries, temples that would light up only on a specific solstice morning, as if to whisper, "Remember me." But the wind does not keep calendars, and the stars do not read inscriptions, and the sun does not care who tried to measure it. So pharaohs, those masters of time, found themselves undone not by rebellion or famine or theft, but by forgetting, by the gentle, inescapable drift of meaning, by the slow fade of names, by the fact that forever is just a word we use when we don't want to admit we're afraid. Every pharaoh believed his tomb would be found again, not by robbers, never them, but by the priests, the descendants, the loyal cults who would maintain the memory, make the offerings, speak the names. They imagined candles lit on death anniversaries, chants echoing for generations, footsteps of the faithful, but the maps were lies, or rather, they were protective deceptions. Tombs were deliberately hidden, entrances disguised, corridors filled in, names omitted from official records, all to keep out the very hands they feared, those that came not to honor but to steal. The result, the pharaohs themselves became lost, not metaphorically, not historically, literally. Entire kings' names, once spoken daily by thousands, vanished, their tombs unrecovered, their bodies never found, their monuments misattributed, their legacies absorbed into the sand like spilled ink. We know of some only because a scribe, somewhere, made a note. The king who was buried near the hills. But which hill, which king, and how far is near? It's strange to imagine that a civilization so obsessed with legacy, so meticulous with death, could misplace its gods. But they did. Because memory is not made of stone. It's made of people, of breath, of speech. And when the people change, when the language shifts, the gods fall, the customs die, then memory cracks, and pharaohs fade. Sometimes they were found centuries later, accidentally, in caches of mummies hurriedly reburied to save them from thieves. No names, just labels like unknown man, laid beside rulers they may have despised in life, now neighbors in oblivion. Sometimes the names were remembered, but the person behind them forgotten. A statue here, a broken cartouche there, the outline of a king whose deeds were never written down, whose reign lasted just long enough to mint a coin but not long enough to matter. And sometimes the tombs were never found at all, still waiting, still silent, still wrapped in gold and linen, dreaming in a darkness that has lasted thousands of years. There is something profoundly lonely in that. A map, carefully drawn, pointing to a legacy that no longer exists. A tomb, built to last forever, hiding a name no one can speak. And a king, once the center of the universe, lying beneath a hill no one thinks to dig. They called it the said festival. A strange ceremony, part birthday, part performance review, part divine recalibration, celebrated after 30 years of rule, and every 3 years thereafter. It was meant to prove that the Pharaoh still had what it took, still strong, still chosen, still favored by the gods. And if not, well, the gods had other options. The said festival was no quiet jubilee. It was theatrical, public, a spectacle staged in temple courtyards where the Pharaoh would don special regalia and run not metaphorically, not symbolically, but physically between markers, proving his vigor before priests and spectators. There were processions, animal sacrifices, renewal rites, dances, songs. The Pharaoh reenacted his own coronation, reaffirmed his bond with the divine, reasserted his cosmic role. It was a way of saying, I am still the axis on which this world turns. But what if he couldn't run? What if he was old, sick, already leaning too hard on the gold-tipped cane that once symbolized victory, now necessity? Sometimes a stand-in would perform the race, a prince, a servant, a priest dressed in royal linens. The audience would cheer, the gods would be satisfied, and the Pharaoh would smile through the ache, pretending it had all been him. It was theater, but so is all power. What's curious is how early pharaohs designed their tombs with images of the said festival, even if they hadn't lived to celebrate one. They carved themselves mid-stride, muscles tense, arms raised, mortalized as forever young, forever worthy. A kind of hope, maybe, or maybe insurance, that even if they died too soon, the gods would see the image, believe the lie, and grant passage. In this, the said festival wasn't just ritual, it was a declaration against decline. A royal "I'm fine" shouted across decades, even when they weren't fine, even when the body broke, even when the state frayed at the edges and the court whispered behind doors. The festival still happened, the music still played, the crown still gleamed. Because to admit failure, physical, spiritual, political, was unthinkable. To admit fatigue was to invite chaos. To stumble was to risk unraveling the story. So they danced, so they ran, or pretended to. And maybe, for a day, they believed it too. That time could be held at bay. That age was just a shadow. That the gods still smiled, even if they didn't. For all their rituals, for all their tombs and temples and inscriptions, the pharaohs never planned for us. Not really. Not for the archaeologists with brushes and flashlights. Not for the tourists whispering in climate-controlled museums. Not for the textbooks and documentaries and podcast episodes dissecting every breath they took, every scar they bore, every mistake they couldn't afford to make. The pharaohs spoke to gods. They built for eternity. But eternity does not come with subtitles. And yet, we stare. We read their fragments. We scrutinize their bones. We x-ray their chests. We speculate about diets, diseases, interpersonal feuds. We give them backstories they never imagined, motives they never confessed, sins they might not have known were sins. We take their privacy and call it research. And what would they think? A king once revered as divine, now laid out under fluorescent lights, his teeth catalogued, his hips measured, his gold melted into digital scans and 3D reconstructions. Children pointed him behind glass, not with fear, but curiosity. Reverence replaced by curiosity. Myth turned to specimen. It is hard not to feel the weight of that reversal. They ruled as gods, demanded offerings, shaped the world in their image, and now we shape them in ours. We project, we analyze, we imagine their inner lives, their pain, their joy, their secrets. And maybe that's fair. Maybe that's the cost of legacy. Because legacy is never what you want it to be. It's what's left. And sometimes what's left is not the gold, not the crown, not the prayers echoing through a still-lit temple. Sometimes it's a brittle femur in a box labeled KV62, a dental record. A hasty mural of a god handing an ankh to a boy whose name we misspell, whose voice we'll never hear, whose heart we cannot weigh because it's gone, removed in embalming, lost to time, and still we wonder, still we care, still we whisper his name. Tutankhamun, not the greatest king, not the longest reign, not even particularly effective, but remembered, somehow. And in that remembering, maybe the pharaohs win after all. Maybe that's all any of us ever really ask. To be misunderstood, perhaps, but not forgotten. There's a final truth we often overlook, buried beneath the golden death masks and monumental architecture. Most pharaohs were not tyrants, not warlords, not fire-breathing demigods. Most were tired of politics, of rituals, of the sheer weight of expectation. They were born into a role they could never decline, asked to embody perfection while navigating court intrigue, priestly demands, and the constant gnawing fear that the gods might be looking away. Power, we assume, feels exhilarating, but more often it just feels heavy. We see it in the inscriptions they left behind, the long hymns to the gods, pleading not just for protection, but for understanding, for validation. We see it in the repetition of titles, beloved of Amen, chosen of Ra, conqueror of chaos, a man reminding himself, again and again, who he was supposed to be. We see it in the way they built, not just for grandeur, but for reassurance. A temple that says, I was worthy. A tomb that says, don't forget me. A statue that says, this is how I want to be seen, even if I never was. And beneath it all, there's a profound, almost childlike hope that someone, someday, will understand. That someone will look past the gold and the glory and the impossible standards and see a man trying to do his best under a crown too large for his head. It's easy to mock kings, easier still to idolize them. But the truth, as always, lives somewhere in between. In the daily grind of being sacred, in the rituals that blur into habit, in the silences between festivals, when the crown is set down and the mirror is kind or not. Most pharaohs didn't get to choose their fate. They didn't ask for divinity. It was thrust upon them like armor, like a weight, like a destiny too old to say no to. So they learned to walk in it, to nod and smile and pronounce decrees while their backs ached and their hearts whispered things they were not allowed to say. Some went mad, some died young, some ruled wisely, quietly, and were forgotten anyway. But all of them, in the end, faced the same sky, the same stars, the same lonely echo of their own name bouncing off temple walls at dusk. And they must have wondered, as we all do in the quiet, will it be enough? Will I be enough? Egypt did not end when the last native pharaoh died. It lingered, like perfume in a long empty room. The Persians came, then the Greeks, then the Romans, each arrival claiming the throne, borrowing the gods, dressing in old symbols as if trying on a costume they didn't quite understand. And yet Egypt allowed it, absorbed them, as it always had. But something had changed. The Pharaoh was no longer a god. He was a client king, a satrap, a puppet, sometimes still called Pharaoh out of habit, out of nostalgia, out of the sheer inertia of tradition. But the role was hollow now. The rituals were thinner. The temples, though still majestic, rang with less conviction, because the soul of empire had shifted. The crown was lighter, but also emptier. And in this new Egypt, with its foreign rulers and hybrid gods, the people adapted, as they always did. They still made offerings, still whispered prayers, still told stories of old kings and golden tombs. But they knew, in some part of themselves, that the gods had grown quiet. The land remained holy, but the heavens had gone cold. Then came Cleopatra, not the first of her name, but the last. A queen born of Greek blood and Egyptian ambition. She wore the cobra crown. She spoke the native tongue. She called herself Isis reborn, but she ruled in a time of endings. By then, the Nile had seen too much. It had carried too many coronations, too many funerals, too many promises written in papyrus and sand. Cleopatra tried to rekindle the old flame. She built, she prayed, she seduced the Roman titans. She made Egypt seem powerful again. But it was illusion. The gods were no longer listening. And when she died, whether by snake or blade or whispered betrayal, the last ember of the old world dimmed. There would be rulers after her, names on coins, statues in basilicas, but no more pharaohs, no more divine kings, born of God and crowned by ritual, standing between earth and sky. Just ruins, just echoes, just a river that remembers more than it reveals. Egypt had not failed. It had simply endured, outliving its kings, outgrowing its gods, becoming a myth even to itself. After the pharaohs were gone after, the crowns were buried, the names chiseled away. The gods no longer fed the temples waited. They didn't crumble right away. That's what we often misunderstand about endings. They don't arrive like thunder. They settle in slowly. A missed offering, a door that no longer opens, a priest who stops showing up, then another, then all. And still the stone stood. The temples, built to house the breath of gods, became hollow vessels. Light still touched their walls. Wind still moved through their courtyards. The carvings remained rows of kings offering bread, incense, eternal devotion. But no one watched. No one answered. Imagine a columned hall where once hundreds gathered, now home to lizards and dust. The scent of incense replaced by the faint salt of human absence. Birds nesting in the sanctuaries. Sunlight creeping in through cracks once carefully sealed. And yet, the temples did not protest. They simply waited. Sometimes, local villagers used them for shelter. Farmers took stones for homes, not out of malice, but necessity. Soldiers turned sanctuaries into barracks. Floodwaters crept in and rewrote the floor plans. Still, the temples waited. Because temples are not just buildings. They are acts of memory in stone. And stone, unlike flesh, remembers without judgment. Some tried to revive the old ways. A desperate priesthood here, a wealthy patron there. Greek rulers who loved the look of divinity, but not the weight of it. They dressed up the gods in new names, Serapis, Isis, Osiris, blending faiths like ingredients in an unfamiliar stew. But the taste had changed. The language had changed. By the time the Romans arrived in force, Egypt was already a museum of itself. The last hieroglyph was written around the year 394 of the Common Era. After that, silence. No more sacred script. No more prayers carved into the walls. The language died not with fire, but with disinterest. And the temple's Karnak, Philae, Abadospi came beautiful skeletons, worship replaced by wonder, offerings replaced by echoes, and eventually dust, but not erasure, because the carvings remained. They outlasted the priests, outlasted the kings, outlasted even the gods they honored. And then, one day, a new kind of priest arrived, not with incense, but with notebooks, not with hymns, but with questions. Scholars, explorers, treasure hunters, the curious and the cruel. Some came with reverence, some with greed. Some saw the ruins as puzzles, others as prizes. But all of them saw something. They saw that the temples had been waiting, and they listened, not perfectly, not kindly, but they tried. They began to copy the symbols, to trace the shapes, to speak the names, however clumsily, and in doing so, they gave the temples what they had been denied for centuries, an audience. And with that audience, memory stirred. Not resurrection, not return, but recognition. And sometimes that is enough, to be seen again, even after so long. For centuries, the pharaohs had spoken in stone, their voices carved into temple walls, tomb ceilings, obelisks taller than trees. Hieroglyphs, those sacred, elegant symbols, weren't just writing, they were spells. Every stroke imbued with power, with intention. Words that could bless, words that could curse, words that could open the gates of the afterlife. But what happens when no one understands them? After the last temple closed, after the last scribe laid down his reed brush, Egypt forgot how to read itself. The language, the key to its soul, went quiet. By the time the Renaissance reached Europe, Egypt had become a riddle. Travelers marveled at the ruins, but couldn't read a single word. Hieroglyphs were thought to be purely decorative, strange bird people, circles and snakes, a forgotten art for a forgotten people. And the pharaohs, once so articulate, fell mute. It wasn't until 1799 that something shifted. A slab of black stone, found near a town called Rosetta. 3 scripts, Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphic. The same decree, written in 3 tongues. It wasn't gold. It wasn't a mummy. It was a bureaucratic announcement of tax relief for temples. But it was a key, a way back in. And in 1822, a French scholar named Jean-François Champollion, after years of obsession and heartbreak, finally cracked the code. He found the names Ramesses, Ptolemy hidden in cartouches. He realized the glyphs were not just pictures, they were language, alive, precise, resurrectable. With this breakthrough, the pharaohs spoke again, not in the booming voice of thunder, but in the careful whisper of translation. Stone walls became stories. Tomb inscriptions became confessions. We learned their titles, their prayers, their fears. Not all at once, not completely. There are still gaps, still arguments, still glyphs that refuse to give up their meaning. But the door was open now, and through it we stepped into a world that had waited 3,000 years to be understood. What's remarkable is how much of it was mundane. A pharaoh's letter to a general concerned about grain shipments. A tax record from a town near Thebes. A poem for a lost lover etched into the side of a workman's house. And then the grander things, the funerary spells, the hymns to Ra, the boasts of kings, the quiet promises of eternal life. It was all still there, locked in stone, waiting for someone to care enough to listen. The pharaohs did not return, but their voices did, and sometimes that's what matters most. Not to live forever, but to be understood, even once. To study the pharaohs is to study ourselves. We don't just look at their ruins, we look through them, hoping to see something familiar staring back. A reflection, a warning, a comfort, and sometimes a justification. We like to believe that the pharaohs were either monsters or miracles, that they were cruel tyrants or enlightened god-kings, builders of wonder or hoarders of power. But the truth, as always, resists easy packaging. Most of them were neither. Most were people. Born into a role, given too much power too soon, surrounded by silence disguised as respect, expected to perform a godhood they never asked for. And so we project. We see their gold and think wealth, their temples and think glory, their tombs and think legacy, but we rarely sit with the cost of being trapped in a system that could not be questioned, the cost of never hearing a truth spoken plainly, the cost of being worshipped when what you needed was advice. The pharaohs did not invent this problem, they inherited it, and we still live with it. Every time we elevate a leader to myth, every time we mistake power for virtue, every time we decide someone must be perfect because we need them to be, that's the mirror we're looking into when we study the kings of the Nile. It's not about how they ruled, it's about how we remember, how we soften what we fear, how we decorate what we don't understand, how we turn pain into marble and forget what it once felt like. And perhaps that's the final, unspoken tragedy of kingship. Not that it ends, but that it is always retold by those who never wore the crown, who never stood beneath the sun and whispered to a god that did not answer, who never had to smile while starving, or pray while doubting, or die while being assured their name would last forever. And it didn't, until now. Until you heard it. History loves its symbols, and the pharaoh, he's perfect. A man burdened with godhood, a crown made of fear and gold, a life lived in performance, a death dressed in myth. But the symbol has outlived the man, and now it wears different clothes. You see it in boardrooms, in coronations of a different kind, in the way we expect perfection from leaders, from idols, from each other. We don't carve their names in stone anymore. We carve them into feeds and headlines, into viral quotes and grainy photographs. We crown them with attention. We exile them with silence. We've kept the ceremony, just changed the tools. And maybe that's the strangest afterlife of the pharaohs. Not the tombs, not the gold, but the idea that someone, somewhere, must carry the burden of being more than human. That someone must never falter, must never age, must never fail. We no longer believe in Horus, or Ra, or Osiris, who judges hearts against feathers, but we believe in fame, in legacy, in image. We still wrap people in expectations too heavy to move in. We still ask the young to perform wisdom, still call exhaustion duty, still build monuments out of stories we know aren't quite true. And if the person cracks under the weight, we replace them, erase their name, find another, and pretend it was always meant to be that way. So when you look at a pharaoh's tomb, when you stand before the mask of Tutankhamun, or read the hymns to Ammon carved into cold stone, don't just ask what it meant then. Ask what it means now. Ask why we still do this. Why we still build crowns out of attention. Why we still expect gods out of people who are barely grown. Why we still fear being forgotten more than being free. And then ask something gentler. Something the pharaohs, in all their gold and silence, may have wished for too. What if being remembered isn't the point? What if peace is? What if we stopped asking to be immortal, and just ask to be understood for a moment by one person in one life. Maybe that would be enough. Maybe it always was. The Nile never cared who ruled it. It simply rose and fell, season after season, century after century. It fed empires without favoritism. It buried their bones in silt. It carried their trade, their prayers, their ashes, their regrets. And one day, though no one knows exactly when, it stopped knowing their names. The river that once defined kingship began to forget. Not out of malice, but because water does not hold memory. It carries it, and then it lets it go. In the height of the Old Kingdom, the Pharaoh was said to be the reason the Nile flooded. His harmony with the gods was reflected in the abundance of the waters. If the crops failed, it was his soul that needed cleansing. If the river swelled, he was praised as its heart. He was not just king of Egypt, he was Egypt. But what happens when Egypt no longer needs a king? What happens when the river rises anyway? There are ancient records lists carved onto stone, tracking the height of the inundation year after year. Kings' names are etched beside the measurements, as if the floods were loyal courtiers. But the measurements continue long after the names stop. The Nile moves through kingdoms, sultans, parliaments, presidents. It doesn't flinch. It doesn't remember. And maybe that's what the pharaohs feared most. Not wealth, not failure, not even silence, but irrelevance. To be so entwined with a land, so central to its myth and machinery, and then to be unnecessary. It is one thing to die a god. It is another to be outlived by your irrigation system. The river did not mourn. The people adapted, built canals, raised dikes, read new stars, worshipped new names. The pharaohs, once the pivot between nature and the divine, became stories, then symbols, then metaphors, until even that became too generous, and they became homework. And still the Nile flowed, and still the papyrus bloomed, and still the herons lifted into the dusk with the same slow grace they had always known. Maybe this is mercy, that the world goes on, that the river does not wait for our legacy, that even the most sacred of kings must eventually step aside. And maybe, somewhere, in the quiet spaces of the afterlife, they understood this too. That being forgotten by the river was not a punishment, it was a release. When the pharaohs ruled, they believed history was theirs to write. They had scribes for truth and sculptors for memory. They chose what was carved in stone and what was left to fade. To write history in Egypt was not to document it, was to control. A careful staging of the past, where victories bloomed larger than cities and defeats dissolved before ink could dry. But history is not loyal. It belongs to the shadows, to the marginalia, the overlooked, the fragments found in tomb robber debris piles, the broken stele used as flooring in a later governor's home, the words scrawled in red ink at the bottom of a tax receipt, muttered complaints from a priest's apprentice that the bread is moldy. The gods are silent. The pharaoh is tired. We find these things. We don't always know what to do with them, because they tell us not of the divine, but of the mundane. They remind us that between the ceremonies, life persisted in quieter tones. A guard counting jars of beer, a palace servant noting the queen's headache, a letter from a father telling his son, the fields are dry. Do not be late in returning. The pharaohs wanted legacy, but legacy lives where you don't expect it. Not in the triumphal reliefs, but in the smudged notes, the misspelled names, the errant fingerprint left in still wet plaster. These are the shadows that linger. They whisper the soft truths beneath the pageantry, that the gods didn't always answer, that the courts sometimes starved, that kings had nightmares and concubines with secrets. And so the history we read is not always the history they wrote. It is the history they tried to suppress. The errors, the cracks, the parts they hoped would never be seen. But shadow, like water, finds the lowest point and rests there. So we reconstruct, we rebuild from echoes. We speak their names again, not as gods, but as humans. Not to glorify, but to understand. And maybe that's more honest. Maybe that's more sacred, because the truth of a king is not in his monuments. It's in what the stones were too proud to say, and in the spaces between them. By the time the last temples fell quiet, the gods had nowhere to go. They did not die, not exactly. Gods never really do. But they changed. They were softened, flattened, dismantled and reassembled into something more palatable, more exportable, more ornamental. A statue of Isis, once carried on the shoulders of chanting priests, now stood on a merchant's shelf in Rome, next to wine jars and lamps. Her face, once divine mystery, now fashionable decor. Horus, once protector of the living Pharaoh, was now a falcon etched into earrings, his eye a symbol for good luck. Osiris, he became a whisper beneath foreign myths. The god of the underworld, wrapped into newer narratives, his feather-weighing scale forgotten, replaced by concepts more abstract, less intimate. They were too beautiful to abandon, too strange to fully believe. So they were reduced, from objects of fear and wonder to souvenirs, from cosmic regulators to conversation pieces. Even the sacred texts once, chanted in sanctuaries so quiet you could hear breath, became curiosities. Their meaning dissolved into phonetics. Their spells became puzzles. Their stories became myths of myths. And through all of this, the pharaohs watched, not literally, but their names, their faces, their dreams. They became part of the decor. Napoleon's soldiers carved their initials into the tombs. Victorian gentlemen bought canopic jars at auction. Children dressed as Cleopatra on Halloween. Museums filled with coffins no one asked to borrow. Papyrus scrolls, framed like art, sold for more than the gold they once blessed. This was not what the pharaohs imagined, but it was what remained. Their gods, now background noise. Their sacred rituals, now exotic. Their legacies, now aesthetic. And yet, something strange happened. People kept returning to the temples, to the stories, to the questions, not with offerings, but with awe. A pharaoh's name was more than identity. It was architecture. Each pharaoh bore 5 names, each layered, each symbolic, each invoking gods, geography, destiny. The birth name, the throne name, the 2 ladies' name, the golden Horus name, the Horus name itself, titles longer than most prayers. Each name a crown, each crown a promise. To speak them aloud was to affirm the cosmos. To inscribe them in stone was to make them eternal. But stone, it turns out, only delays forgetting. It does not prevent it. There are kings whose names we now struggle to pronounce. Some are known only by their burial sites, synonymous monarchs entombed beneath painted ceilings. Their voices vanished, but for a handful of glyphs. Others are known by the wrong names altogether, their histories entangled with successors, or rewritten by rivals. A few were purposefully erased, chiseled out, replaced, their names scratched from monuments, their stories reassigned, their victories claimed by others. To strike out a name was not just vengeance, it was annihilation. The second death, written with hammers. But even that wasn't always successful, because names linger in fragments, in scrolls, in the margins of foreign trade records, in a priest's board scribble, in the wrong spelling on a Greek historian's papyrus, like echoes in a broken pot, still resonating. And sometimes names return. Tutankhamun, who was barely remembered in his own time, is now known across the world. Akhenaten, erased from official memory, resurrected by scholars who found his sunlit hymns too strange to ignore. Hatshepsut, the forgotten queen king, her statues shattered, her name buried under others' and yet she rose again in the quiet reverence of rediscovery. There is a slow justice in this. The pharaohs may have failed to control their legacies, but they succeeded in making them impossible to ignore. Their names were not eternal, but they were stubborn, and so we learn them. We mispronounce them. We carry them. Ramesses Seti, Thutmose, Nefertiti, some real, some reconstructed, some still waiting in the dark, beneath desert stone, their hieroglyphs intact, their stories unfinished. And one day, perhaps, another name will surface, another crown of syllables pulled from sand, and once more we will speak a pharaoh's name into the world. And that name will rise, gently, like dust in morning light, not to rule, but simply to be remembered, not to worship, but to witness, to learn, to stand before the stone and feel something ancient stir in the ribs. Maybe that's a new kind of divinity, not fear, but attention, not obedience, but care. The gods may no longer rule, but they are not gone. They have simply stepped back, into the alcoves, into the museums, into the margins of our imagination, where all things holy eventually retire, and there, quietly, they wait. A pharaoh's name was more than identity. It was architecture. Each pharaoh bore 5 names, each symbolic, each invoking gods. Geography, destiny, the birth name, the throne name, the throne name, the 2 ladies' name, the golden Horus name, the Horus name itself, titles longer than most prayers, each name a crown, each crown a promise. To speak them aloud was to affirm the cosmos. To inscribe them in stone was to make them eternal. The stone, it turns out, only delays forgetting. It does not prevent it. There are kings whose names we now struggle to pronounce. Some are known only by their burial sites, anonymous monarchs entombed beneath painted ceilings. Their voices vanished but for a handful of glyphs. Others are known by the wrong names altogether, their histories entangled with successors or rewritten by rivals. A few were purposefully erased, chiseled out, replaced, their names scratched from monuments, their stories reassigned, their victories claimed by others. To strike out a name was not just vengeance, it was annihilation. The second death, written with hammers. But even that wasn't always successful, because names linger in fragments, in scrolls, in the margins of foreign trade records, in a priest's board scribble, in the wrong spelling on a Greek historian's papyrus, like echoes in a broken pot, still resonating. And sometimes names return. Tutankhamun, who was barely remembered in his own time, is now known across the world. Akhenaten, erased from official memory, resurrected by scholars who found his sunlit hymns too strange to ignore. Hatshepsut, the forgotten queen king, her statues shattered, her name buried under others' and yet she rose again in the quiet reverence of rediscovery. There is a slow justice in this. The pharaohs may have failed to control their legacies, but they succeeded in making them impossible to ignore. Their names were not eternal, but they were stubborn, and so we learn them. We mispronounce them. We carry them. Ramesses Seti, Thutmose, Nefertiti, some real, some reconstructed, some still waiting in the dark, beneath desert stone, their hieroglyphs intact, their stories unfinished. And one day, Perhaps another name will surface, another crown of syllables pulled from sand, and once more we will speak a Pharaoh's name into the world, and that name will rise gently like dust in morning light, not to rule, but simply to be remembered. We often think of the pharaohs as surrounded by people, by gods, by history, but what they truly inhabited was solitude, not just the ceremonial kind, not the pageantry of parades or the theatre of court, a deeper solitude, one that comes from being watched by everyone and known by no one. Even the closest advisors spoke in riddles. Even the most trusted wives were part of a dynasty, a function, a myth. The pharaoh was the center of the world, but centers, by design, cannot move. Everyone else circles. Everyone else speaks in orbit. That kind of isolation isn't majestic. It's bone deep. It sits with you during the morning rituals, when the priests chant in practiced unison, and you realize they'd say the same words for your successor. It lingers at banquets, where laughter always feels just slightly too staged. It sharpens in the still hours of the night, when you lie in a gilded bed, wondering if the gods you represent are as silent as they seem. And yet, despite this, the pharaohs endured, not because they were strong, but because they had no choice. There's a strange nobility in that, to wear the mask even when it cracks, to walk the temple path even when your knees ache, to bless a kingdom that might not bless you back. Immortality, for them, was never freedom. It was an assignment, to live in expectation, to die in ceremony, to be embalmed in abstraction, and then to wait trapped in linen and hope, not for resurrection, not even for justice, but for remembrance, which, in the end, is lonelier than death, because it means your name might rise again, but yourself, your truth, your trivers of doubt and flickers of joy will never be known, only imagined, only interpreted, only displayed behind glass. And so the pharaohs became still life, gods without pulse, legends without breath, and maybe, quietly, they knew this, and maybe, quietly, they grieved it. But still, they ruled. Because sometimes, being remembered is all we have left, even if it means being alone forever. In a kingdom where the sun itself answered to the king, perhaps the deepest fear was irrelevance. The pharaoh was not just a leader, he was the linchpin of Mat, the divine order. His role was not to govern merely, but to maintain harmony between the mortal and divine realms. Crops grew because of him. Stars moved because of him. The people lived in peace because he balanced the invisible scales of the universe. Or so they were told, and perhaps, at first, they believed it. But belief is a fragile currency. What happens when the floods fail? When the borders buckle? When the gods fall silent, no matter how many bulls are sacrificed? What happens when the people begin to whisper? Perhaps the gods are displeased. Perhaps the pharaoh is no longer chosen. There are papyri filled with omens, with instructions for interpreting dreams, with desperate attempts to reassert control over a cosmos that was slipping. And somewhere between these lines lives the pharaoh's most human hope to still be needed. Not worshipped, not feared, just needed. The way a child needs a parent, the way a land needs a center. There are records, modest, overlooked, of pharaohs touring flood-damaged villages, distributing grain, praying publicly, not as gods, but as men trying to remind their people, I am here, I still matter. Sometimes they failed, sometimes they were killed, but sometimes that quiet service, the moment a king stepped down from the throne and sat among his people, was the closest they came to grace. Not in gold, not in temples, but in the way a peasant looked at them and said, "He came, he saw us, he tried." It's a strange kind of legacy, to be remembered not for conquest, but for care. The pharaohs wanted eternity. But perhaps, on their softer days, they would have settled for something smaller. A name spoken not in fear, but in gratitude. Not all rulers were kings, and not all kings were men. In a world where the pharaoh was the divine bridge between earth and sky, the role was often treated as inseparable from masculinity. But history, stubborn and subtle, remembers the exceptions. And sometimes the exceptions tell us more than the rules ever could. Hatshepsut was not supposed to reign. She was a queen, yes, daughter of a king, wife of another, regent to her stepson, the heir. She was trained to advise, to support, to ornament, not to rule. But when the throne was empty, and the heir too young, she stepped in, and never stepped back. She crowned herself Pharaoh, not Queen Regent, not Dowager Pharaoh. She wore the royal kilt. She took on the full titulary. She even wore the false beard, the ceremonial marker of kingship, carved and strapped beneath the chin like a second identity. Not to pretend to be a man, but to become the role. The gods, after all, were accustomed to beards. She ruled for over 2 decades, built temples that still stand, opened trade routes, oversaw a time of prosperity. Her reign was calm, rich, filled with the quiet work of order. She left behind monuments, obelisks, statues, and then after her death, her name was almost erased, literally chiseled off walls. Her statues destroyed, defaced, buried, not by the people, not by the gods, but by her successor, the boy who grew into the king she once protected. Why? Some say pride, others say politics. A need to restore traditional lineage, to clean the slate, to pretend her rule had never been necessary, but the erasure failed. Her temple at Deir el-Bahri still rises from the cliffs like a hymn in stone. Her likeness survives in broken statues, later inscriptions, and the whispers of modern historians who look at her shattered face and see power, not shame. And she was not alone. There was Sobenferu, who ruled briefly but firmly. Twosrat, who reigned in chaos. Nefertiti, perhaps briefly a pharaoh herself, hidden behind titles. Cleopatra, polyglot, politically precise, was the last of them, ruling not as a shadow of Rome, but as Egypt incarnate, if only for a moment. These women remind us that the crown, for all its ritual and rigidity, could bend, could adapt, could be worn by someone who refused to be invisible. They remind us that even in the most myth-heavy cultures, where gender was tied to divinity, power had loopholes, and that sometimes the best pharaohs were not those who were born to it, but those who took it anyway, for all the gold, for all the armies, for all the stone piled into monuments too massive to forget. The real power in Egypt often lived behind the veil, in the temples, among the priests. They were not elected, not crowned. They did not march or conquer, but they outlasted kings, outmaneuvered dynasties, outlived gods, even quietly, methodically, wrapped in white linen, chanting in tongues older than memory. The pharaoh was divine in theory, but the priests, they were divine in practice. They knew the rituals, knew the calendars, knew which god needed which flower on which day in which temple to keep the sky from unraveling. And if they stopped, if they paused the liturgy, skipped the offering, let the oil burn too long, would the world end? Would anyone notice? They never tested it, at least not at first. But slowly, subtly, they did what all bureaucracies do. They filled the gaps. When pharaohs grew weak, the priests stepped in. When kings were children or puppets or just too distracted by wars and wives, the temples became administrative engines. They collected taxes, managed land, appointed officials. Their influence grew thick as incense. By the time of the 21st dynasty, the high priest of Ammon in Thebes was arguably more powerful than the king in the north, and everyone knew it. But power in robes is quieter than power in crowns. It doesn't need to be seen, it just needs to be obeyed. The priests weren't usurpers, they were survivors. They understood the language of continuity. They knew that people did not need the same pharaoh forever, but they needed the same prayers, the same festivals, the same comfort of rhythm. And when the gods began to fade, the priests adapted. They aligned themselves with foreign rulers. They rebranded old rites. They combined deities, merged pantheons, layered Greek onto Egyptian, Roman onto Greek. Isis became Aphrodite. Osiris wore the toga of Pluto. The prayers changed shape, but the voices remained, until one day they stopped. Not all at once, but like a song losing volume. The last temple of ancient Egypt, at Pharaoh, held on until the 6th century of the Common Era, a full 1,000 years after most pharaohs were dust. The priests there still lit candles, still recited hymns, still made offerings to gods who no longer had empires. And then, one day, they locked the doors, not with ceremony, just quietly. The last priest walked away. The last god went to sleep, and Egypt, for the first time in 3,000 years, fell silent. Not defeated, just done. And after silence comes play. Centuries passed, languages changed, faiths shifted. The desert reclaimed what it could, and what it couldn't, it buried. Obelisks lay sideways, statues collapsed. Temples, once charting the architecture of heaven, became quarries for homes and fortresses, and the children returned, not to worship, but to wonder, to climb the broken backs of gods, to chase lizards through colonnades, to dig with bare hands in hot sand and find accidentally a face, a carving, a scrap of pottery with a bird and a sun disk. They didn't always know what they'd found, but they made stories anyway. Because children are born archaeologists of myth, they know how to look at a cracked statue and see a story. A king who talked to the moon, a queen who could speak with cats, a god with 2 faces who never blinked. And so the pharaohs lived again, not as rulers, not even as memories, but as games, as sketches in the dust, as whispered legends told over fires in the outskirts of what used to be Thebes. This is not how the pharaohs imagined their legacy. They saw obelisks pointing to the sun. What they got were rumors and playgrounds. But maybe that's better, because a legacy that insists on reverence will always crumble under indifference. But a legacy that makes someone curious, that lasts. It jumps centuries like stepping stones. It survives not in palaces, but in laughter, in wonder, in a child asking, "Who was that with the crown and the bird on his shoulder?" And someone answering, "I don't know, but let's find out." And so they dig, with sticks, with stories, with imagination, and the pharaohs smile beneath the sand, not because they are remembered perfectly, but because they are remembered at all. There's a kind of hush that falls in museums at night. Not silence, exactly, but a stillness, a reverence. The guards speak softer, the lights dim, the artifacts seem to breathe, just slightly. Somewhere in a glass case, a sarcophagus sleeps under LED spotlights. Nearby, a golden amulet catches the edge of a shadow. a fragment of papyrus, so old it's more breath than paper, trembles behind its sealed enclosure, and someone stops, reads a name. Maybe it's familiar Ramesses, Akhenaten, Cleopatra. Maybe it's unknown, a string of symbols barely translated, a title worn thin by time. But they say it aloud anyway. Thutmose, Setepena, Motkare. And for a moment, that name returns. Not with trumpets, not with glory, but with a whisper like dust stirred by the edge of a footstep. You cannot rule from behind glass, but you can be heard. Just once, just briefly, and that may be all eternity was ever asking for. Not permanence, but recurrence. The pharaohs thought their names would be said forever in temples filled with gold. But they are said instead by school children on field trips, by old tourists in whispering awe, by grad students with tired eyes and reverent fingers tracing hieroglyphs in a catalogue too large to ever finish. And each time a name is spoken, each time someone leans closer, they are a little less gone, not resurrected, but recalled. Like a dream you almost forgot, now hovering just beneath your skin. This, perhaps, is the third kind of death. Not the body, not the name, but the voice. And this, then, is the third kind of life. Not flesh, not fame, but being spoken of, softly, by someone who cares to remember. Not because they have to, but because something about youth gold, the godhood, the grief still reaches them, even now, even here, even in the dark. Every monument dreams of something, even stone has longing. The pyramids, those immense triangles slicing into the heavens, were not just tombs. They were aspirations in architecture, efforts to touch the sky with geometry, to defy gravity, to point eternally towards something bigger, and within them, silence. A king, sealed in gold, surrounded by spells, by maps to the afterlife, by amulets that whispered protection into the ears of a god who might be listening. But the pyramid itself said nothing. It just endured, weathered sandstorms, watched empires come and go, felt the feet of conquerors and caretakers, of those who came to revere and those who came to plunder. It outlived every expectation, and yet it too began to sink, not collapsing, beneath metaphor, beneath misreading, beneath the centuries of projection, myth-making, nationalism, tourism, exploitation, until what it meant was no longer clear. Was it a tomb, a time machine, a message, a warning? The pyramid never answered, but it stayed, which is its own answer. To endure is a form of speech. To remain upright when the world falls apart is a kind of quiet roar. And in that way, every stone block hauled by calloused hands under a sun too sharp to reason with still sings, not in hieroglyphs, but in presence, in mass, in shadow. The pharaohs may have whispered to gods, but the pyramids whisper to us. Every time we look and wonder, how did they do it? We are touching a line that runs through centuries, a dream that chose not to die, a sky that someone once believed they could reach. And even now, when the stars are dimmed by city lights and the old gods walk only in memory, the pyramids remain. Not because they are sacred, but because someone needed them to be, and that need still echoes. Gold has always lied, not with malice, not even deliberately, but gently, comfortingly, the way a myth lies by telling a version of the truth that is easier to bear. The pharaohs wrapped themselves in it, not just in death, but in life. Crowns, anklets, amulets, pressed against skin that would one day turn to dust. Their thrones gleamed, their sandals sparkled, even their canes were chased in gold, as if frailty could be disguised with enough reflection. To the living, gold said power. To the gods, it said devotion. To us, it says mystery. But to the dead, to the Pharaoh lying beneath layers of resin-soaked linen, breathless in his mask of hammered radiance, gold says nothing, because gold, for all its luster, is cold. It cannot grieve, and there is grief here, a lot of it, in the aching symmetry of tomb paintings, scenes painted over and over, gods repeating their gestures like exhausted stage actors. In the prayers written in shaking script, more urgent than grand, more desperate than devout. In the fact that so many pharaohs died young, died worried, died wondering if it was enough, if the gods would remember, if the priests would come, if the tomb would stay closed long enough for the soul to find its way. And perhaps this is the softest betrayal, that the most powerful people in one of history's greatest civilizations died not with certainty, but with hope. That they crossed into the next world clutching spells like lifeboats, whispering names of gods who may have already stopped listening. That their final rest was not a triumphant entry into eternity, but a gamble, an if the heart is light, if the name is spoken, if the tomb is sealed. Gold could not answer those questions. It could only shimmer. And so the pharaohs, these glittering giants of the ancient world, were not just rulers, they were mourners, mourning the lives they didn't get to live, the truths they weren't allowed to say, the peace they hoped would follow the pageantry. And now we look at their treasures, behind glass, labeled and curated, and maybe what we're seeing isn't wealth. Maybe it's longing, wrapped in brilliance, too beautiful to ignore, too human to fully understand. Imagine speaking every day and never being heard for who you are. That was the Pharaoh's voice, trained from childhood to recite blessings, to deliver decrees, to give speeches in a tone that was not his own. His words were often written by scribes, filtered through priests, shaped to match the godhead he was expected to perform. Even his laughter, if allowed, was measured, appropriately godlike, appropriately restrained. He could not grieve in public. He could not doubt in prayer. He could not, under any circumstances, say, "I am afraid." The Pharaoh's voice belonged to the office, not the man. So what did he whisper to himself in those rare moments alone? What was the real voice beneath the throne? Perhaps it cracked when no one was listening. Perhaps it echoed in private chambers, where the incense had burned too low, where the mask had been set down for the night, and he could just for an instant speak as a person, not a god, not a king, just a man with too many names and not enough rest. But no one recorded that voice. The official language of the Pharaoh was permanence. Carved in stone, grand, declarative, eternal. It did not leave room for maybe. It did not bend for I don't know. And so we have only echoes. We do not know what Akhenaten whispered to Nefertiti in the blue light of dawn. We do not know if Tutankhamun wept when he realized he might never walk without pain. We do not know what Hatshepsut told herself in the quietest hour of the night, when the temple had emptied and the desert winds sounded like the dead. These voices were buried with them, not because they were unimportant, but because they were unfit for the role. To be Pharaoh was to be edited, curated, exhibited. So now we look at their words formal, majestic, impersonal, and try to hear the person inside them. We strain to find emotion in the geometry of hieroglyphs. We invent feelings for the stone. And maybe that's the mercy of time, that it allows us to imagine their voice as it might have truly sounded. Not perfect, not powerful, but tired, tender, human. And maybe, if we listen long enough, it will speak again, not from a monument, not from a museum, but from somewhere closer, somewhere just beneath the noise of modern life. A whisper, finally free. Crowns do not survive well. They are heavy, ornate, filled with meaning. But meaning erodes faster than gold. The Pharaoh's crown, sometimes called the Keprish or the Piatient, or simply the double crown, was less an accessory than a cosmological thesis. It united Upper and Lower Egypt. It embodied the balance of opposites. It was a visual treaty between the papyrus and the lotus. It was power perched on a skull, but none of them remain. Not truly, not intact. We've found fragments, decorations, descriptions, but the crowns themselves, gone. Even the most sacred objects are vulnerable to time, theft, flame, and the slow forgetting that creeps across centuries like dust. So the symbols we associate with pharaohs, the flail, the crook, the cobra, the vulture, are known to us mostly through carvings, through murals and statues, through stone that tells a stylized story, not a lived one. The real crowns. They turned to dust, melted down, buried, lost. And isn't that fitting? Because the crown, like the concept of kingship itself, was never meant to last. It was a costume stitched to a ritual. It mattered only while someone was looking. It had weight, yes, but only because we agreed it did. And once that agreement faded, the crown was just another object, and the king just another man. There is a deep melancholy in this, the realization that even the most sacred symbols are temporary, that even the thing you spend your life protecting, embodying, representing will one day be misunderstood, misplaced, reduced to iconography, and yet they wore them anyway. Every morning, every ceremony, every statue, knowing, maybe, that the weight was metaphor, that the crown was not armor but obligation, not proof of divinity, but a burden disguised as glory. And now, when we see those crowns on museum placards or in history books, we imagine them whole, gleaming, untouched. But the truth is softer, more human. The crowns are gone, and the heads that wore them are quiet now, not because they failed, but because they finished. And the sand, which once bowed beneath royal feet, now holds their memory the way it holds everything, gently, without judgment. Somewhere above the tombs, the sky has never moved. Not really. The same stars the pharaohs charted, the same constellations carved into sarcophagus lids and painted onto temple ceilings, they're still there, still wheeling silently above the Nile, still echoing with a rhythm so ancient it predates language. Orion, Sirius, the Milky Way, which they called the celestial river, the twin of the Nile, flowing through eternity. The pharaohs believed that upon death their souls would ascend into that sky, become stars themselves, join the cosmic order, reunite with Ra as he sailed his sunbark across the heavens by day and through the underworld by night. To die was not to vanish, it was to rise. But to rise, one needed preparation, spells, amulets, maps of the underworld painted in vibrant ochre and indigo, showing the rivers of fire, the caverns of serpents, the gates guarded by gods who did not forgive easily. And in those spells, one desire echoed again and again. Let me pass, let me not be forgotten, let me see the sky again. They weren't asking for worship. Not really. They were asking for transit. They were asking for rest. And somewhere in those prayers, between the myth and the metaphor lives, something familiar. Something that speaks not just to kings, but to all of us. Because we all look up, even now. We all, at some point, stare at the stars and ask, am I small? Am I seen? Will anything of me remain? And maybe the pharaohs, in all their gold and granite, were just the most extravagant expression of that question. Maybe they built pyramids not to show their greatness, but to aim their longing, to mark the earth in alignment with the sky, as if to say, I was here. I tried, look up and remember, and so we do. Not perfectly, not always kindly, but we look, and that, somehow, feels like the softest kind of triumph. A voice carried not by wind, but by wonder. A name carried not by fame, but by curiosity. A soul that never quite stopped rising, because the sky never closed, and the stars never stopped listening. By now, the story feels quiet. Not ended, but stilled. Like a drum that's stopped beating, yet still echoes in your chest. We've walked through deserts of gold and grief, through temples and tombs and shadows of names. We've watched kings rise with the sun and sink beneath the sand. We've listened to the silence left behind by voices once called divine. And now, what's left? Stillness. The kind that doesn't demand attention. The kind that waits. In Egypt today, the monuments remain. So do the rivers, the stars, the people. Tourists arrive with cameras and bottled water, snapping photos of statues, too weathered to smile back. Guides repeat the same stories, versions of versions, abridged and translated and softened for comfort. Children sell postcards outside temples. Locals build houses near ancient burial grounds. And beneath it all, the past hums like a distant song. Not proud, not loud, just present. The pharaohs are no longer gods. Their names are now trivia. Their rituals are mostly broken. Their curses defanged, their power long since redistributed to quieter places, mothers, teachers, strangers who hold someone's world together without ceremony or crown. And yet, when we visit, we still lower our voices, still step lightly, still pause before the carvings, as if something sacred might wake if we look too long. Because deep down we recognize the truth. Stillness speaks. It says, this mattered. Someone once stood here, believing they could hold the universe together with prayer and limestone. Someone was buried here, hoping not to be forgotten. Someone once believed so fiercely in their place in the world that they built mountains to hold the sky in place. And now you're here, listening, not to conquest, not to glory, but to something quieter, a breath caught in stone, a heartbeat slowed by time, a name rising again, not to rule, but to be held. The pharaohs loved eternity, or at least they feared its alternative. So they built love stories in limestone, declared devotion in cartouches that wound around the ankles of gods. They named queens as divine consorts, wrapped them in poetry, buried them in separate tombs nearby, as if proximity could promise reunion. And yet, for all that gold, all those offerings, so many of them died alone. Not unaccompanied, but alone. There's a difference. Their bodies were surrounded by treasures, guards painted on the walls, servants buried with them, food, spells, furniture, but not affection. Affection, it turns out, doesn't mummify well. We don't know who held their hands. We don't know who whispered to them, in private, that they were more than their role. We don't know if anyone ever said, it's okay to rest. What we have are official inscriptions, grand, God-touched declarations of union and piety, but not the quiet love, not the small things, not the loneliness just before dawn, when the stars feel too far and the priest's words ring hollow, not the ache of being surrounded and never seen, And that is perhaps the deepest sorrow in all these tombs, that they were built not for love, but for proof of love. Look, they seem to say, I was cherished, I was divine, I was never alone, but the stones cannot answer back. They echo only what they are given. And in that echo, sometimes, there is a hollowness. Not because they were unloved, but because the love was never allowed to be simple, never allowed to be soft. So we are left to guess, to read between the lines of formal titles and ceremonial phrases, to wonder whether that necklace was a gift of duty or desire, whether that shared tomb was strategic or sacred, whether the mask was a comfort or a final indignity. And maybe that is our role now, to offer what they were denied, to imagine love not as monument, but as memory, not carved in stone, but whispered in the dark. Empires die, even the golden ones, even the ones that measure time in dynasties and breath in granite. The pharaohs ruled for over 3,000 years, longer than most of human history has existed. They built calendars older than the language I'm speaking, monuments more precise than the tools used to rediscover them, civilizations folded and unfolded in the shadows of their obelisks. And still Egypt fell, not suddenly, just inevitably. The sun never stopped rising, but the belief that it rose for them did. And yet Egypt was never just its rulers. It was never only its gods. It was its people, the ones whose names were never carved, the ones who built tombs they could never enter, the ones who paid taxes in grain, who wove the linen, who baked the offerings the gods never tasted. They remembered the pharaohs, but they remembered themselves, too. And when the last crown rusted, when the last cartouche was cracked by time or chisels, it was those quiet, patient memories that carried Egypt forward, into the Coptic chants, into Arabic poetry, into the rhythm of water wheels along the Nile, still turning long after the temples went quiet. The pharaohs may have declared themselves gods, but it was the people who made them real, by feeding them, by fearing them, by finally forgetting them, and then, centuries later, remembering them again. Not as gods, not as tyrants, but as part of the human inheritance, the long, strange, aching record of what we build when we're afraid of being lost. The pharaohs wanted eternity, and they got something stranger. They became part of the story, not the author, not even the hero, just a chapter, just a shadow that touches ours. And if we've done anything right, tonight, anything at all, it's that we've let them speak again. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Even in death, pharaohs were busy. Their tombs were calendars. Their coffins were maps. Their bodies were wrapped not just in linen, but in expectation of movement, of judgment, of continuation. The afterlife was no paradise. It was a journey, a test, a bureaucracy of the soul. They would stand before Osiris. They would recite the negative Confession 42 declarations of innocence. I have not stolen, I have not lied, I have not slain the sacred goose. They would have their hearts weighed against a feather, too heavy, and they would be devoured. Just right, and they would pass, and then, only then, could they rest. But no pharaoh really believed in rest, not in the way we do. Rest was conditional, earned through preparation, maintained through memory, dependent on priests, on rituals, on descendants keeping the proper offerings at the proper times in the proper ways. Rest was performance, continued after death. And now, there are no more priests, no more daily offerings, no more chants echoing through limestone halls. Only tourists, only cameras, Only glass cases and climate controls and placards that try to explain eternity in 175 words or less. But maybe that's a kind of rest, not the one they expected, but something quieter, not silence, but stillness, not ceremony, but care, the kind that comes from being looked at slowly, thought about, spoken of with awe, confusion, empathy, the kind of rest that doesn't need incense or gold, just a moment of human recognition. And maybe that's the final answer, that rest is not being undisturbed. It's being seen without being demanded. It's being understood without being used. It's lying beneath layers of misunderstanding, tourism, scholarship, imagination, and knowing. At last, you are no longer alone. Not because the world needs your rule, but because it remembered your humanity. Not the God, not the mask. Just the person who carried it all, and finally put it down. And now we come to the end. Not of Egypt, not of the pharaohs, but of the telling. The moment in every long night when the story slows. Not because it has run out of words, but because it has given you enough. There's no clean conclusion here. No final lesson carved in stone. History doesn't close like a book, it drifts, lingers, fades like incense long after the fire's gone out. The pharaohs are still with us, in ways too quiet to catalogue, in our longing for legacy, in our fear of silence, in the way we build and love and pretend we aren't afraid of being forgotten. And though we dress it differently, the impulse is the same, to leave something behind, a name, a kindness, a trace of warmth in the memory of someone we'll never meet. The pharaohs tried to do it with gold, with gods, with greatness. And maybe they succeeded, not because we remember them exactly as they wished, but because we remember them at all. That is, perhaps, the softest kind of immortality, not carved in cartouches, not lit by torches, but spoken aloud in a voice like yours or mine in the still hours of night. When someone says, "I didn't know this would move me. I didn't expect to feel this much, but now I do." And so, dear listener, let the light stay dim. Let the story settle like dust. You've walked with kings tonight, not because they were divine, but because they were real. And they, like all of us, were trying to matter, to love, to rest. So close your eyes now. Let the Nile recede. Let the temples go quiet. Let the names dissolve gently on your breath, as if whispered to the stars. You do not need a crown to be remembered. You just need to be heard. And tonight, you were. And if you've made it all the way here, thank you, truly. Thank you for spending this time with me, for listening, for wondering, for letting history soften the edge of your night. I hope the pharaohs kept you company. I hope the silence felt a little less heavy. If this helped you drift, or think, or feel something you didn't expect, well, that means everything. If you'd like more stories like this, you're warmly invited to subscribe. No pressure, just whenever you're ready for another quiet walk through time. Until then, take care of yourself. Sleep well, and may you, too, be remembered gently. Good night.